have Ethan Knudson, and I will be moderating for this breakout session. And for today, Ethan is teaching on Daniel 8, elusive factors and elusive figures, and he is an independent scholar who just graduated with his PhD from St. Andrews.
Cool, great. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Yeah, so this is a chapter of the thesis that's been kind of reworked a little bit and compacted so that we don't go on and on, but yeah. So we're going to dive into Daniel 8, all right? So if you want to open up your Bibles to there, that would be great. We're going to be jumping around to a few different places, but that might be a good home base. Right. There is an easily missed irony at the heart of Daniel 8. Unlike the previous visions recounted in Daniel 2 and 7, the main reference of Daniel's vision in chapter 8 are explicitly identified within the vision itself. So in Daniel 8, 20 and 22, the angel Gabriel makes it plain to Daniel that the ram and goat he sees in the vision refer respectively to the kingdoms of Media, Persia, and Greece. However, despite this unique clarity with regard to the vision's reference, several key gaps, ironically, are left unaddressed, especially when we consider the vision from the perspective of Daniel at this point in the narrative. So the chapter is set within the third year of Belshazzar's reign. This is the first verse of Daniel 8. Daniel's thus living in exile outside of the land. The temple lies in ruins, but he receives a vision in which the people of God already have returned to the land, and the temple has already been rebuilt. These realized hopes are taken for granted, though, and not at all the focal points of the vision. Instead, the vision centers upon a future Greek king represented by the goat's small horn, at whose hands the returned people of God suffer greatly, and the rebuilt temple is desecrated. To make matters worse, the vision contains virtually no explanation as to, 1, why the people of God will suffer this fate, 2, any hope of restoration afterwards, and 3, how God will bring the adversary to justice. With these three gaps, it's no wonder that the chapter closes with a rather disturbed and confused Daniel. While these three questions are not directly dealt with within the vision of Daniel 8, I will argue that they are nonetheless addressed by means of allusions to other passages in the Hebrew Bible. In particular, three examples of interbiblical allusion will be explored. So 1, the ram and goat of Daniel 8, acting in stark contrast to their normative roles in the rest of the Hebrew Bible. 2, the staunch-faced king of Daniel 8 in connection to Deuteronomy 28. And 3, correspondences between Daniel 8 and the book of Ezekiel, especially the pastoral images of justice and restoration in Ezekiel 34 and 35. In each of these connections, elusive factors find clarity by means of elusive figures. Since this is in honor of Ray, we had to have some puns in here, right? So below, I'll explore each of these instances of allusion in detail, describing both how they are signaled, how we're supposed to recognize them, and then what potential interpretive purposes that they bear upon the vision of Daniel 8. So, example number 1. The two central visions in the vision of Daniel 8 are a ram and a goat. And how these animals act within the vision is directly contrary to their characterization elsewhere. So despite the fact that rams and goats can be aggressive, that's just not how they're described in the Hebrew Bible. The primary depiction of rams and goats across the Bible is in the context of the sacrificial system. They're offered as sacrifices. They're eaten as food. Their hides and wool are used for textile as well, but the primary context in which they appear is as sacrifices. But in Daniel 8, far from being docile and domesticated, the ram and goat are violent and combative, charging, trampling, crushing, dominating everything in their path. And I would argue that we're supposed to notice this irony and the subversion of the norm, and especially since there's other verbal connections with the key texts that establish the norm. So, first off is how the ram is introduced. So it's slightly odd. So in Daniel 8:3, Daniel opens the vision saying, I looked up and saw one ram. So the question is, why specify that there's one ram? Was he expecting more than one? No other rams appear as the vision progresses. And all modern English translations that I'm aware of translate verse 3 as I saw a ram rather than one ram, which that is a possible, though rare, translation of the Hebrew for one, echad. And I think that is the meaning here. Daniel sees a ram, but it's just expressed in an irregular way. But perhaps the reason for the irregular syntax here is a connection with sacrificial lists, where the phrase ayal echad, one ram, is common. In other words, we're meant to notice the syntactical oddity of Daniel 8:3 in order to draw our attention to the phrase, and from there, draw our attention to the text where the phrase is found. And lo and behold, when we look at those texts, there's other shared words and themes that are present as well, especially when we look at Numbers 28 and 29 and Leviticus 16. So if we go to Numbers 28 and 29 first, alongside the phrase one ram is the reference to the regular offering in Daniel 8. So a key element of the goat's small horn subversive action is the removal of the regular offering, hatamid. And so this is usually taken to refer to the daily burnt offerings, which consists of two lambs, one offered every morning, the other at twilight, along with the grain offering and the drink offering. And one place that this is described is Numbers 28. And then the rest of Numbers 28 and 29 detail the weekly Sabbath offerings, the monthly offerings, along with the offerings particular to each of the major annual festivals. So Numbers 28 and 29 summarizes basically the whole sacrificial calendar. And throughout all of this, the regular or the daily offering features very prominently. So just these two chapters, the daily burnt offerings are referenced 17 times. And alongside this, rams and goats factor frequently in the list, and even the specific phrase, as I mentioned, one ram ayal echad. So all those factors considered, Numbers 28 and 29, it seems that Daniel 8 could certainly be alluding to that. And alongside that is Leviticus 16, which describes the Day of Atonement. So the one day of the year when the high priest enters into the Holy of Holies. So notably for the present discussion, the offerings detailed in Leviticus 16 are one bull, one ram, ayal echad, and two goats. Now remember that in Daniel 8, 11 and 12, the goat's small horn, it casts down the regular offering and the sanctuary. But in Leviticus 16:16, it's the blood of one of the goats that makes atonement for the sanctuary because of the people's uncleanness. And crucially, that language describing the sanctuary in both texts overlaps. So taking all this together, a key purpose, I'd argue, for this network of allusions is irony in how these two figures are presented in the vision of Daniel 8. So even as the ram and goat subvert the norm, or they negate the intertext, there's shared language creating connections with the key texts that establish the norm. So Numbers 28 and 29 summarizing the whole calendar, and Leviticus 16 and that central day of the Day of Atonement. And all in all, the irony is clear. The ram and the goat of Daniel 8 do not act like rams and goats normally do. Not only in being combative, but most poignantly in that the goat, a sacrificial animal which functions as a sin offering for the people of God and to make atonement for the sanctuary, oppresses the people of God in Daniel 8 and upends the sanctuary and the regular offering. But, of course, this is a vision, so there's another level at play here, right? These figures represent nations and kings. So we also have to think about what this has to bear on the characterization of Greece and this particular Greek king. So because of how the goat is described ironically and subversively, it highlights the actions of this oppressive Greek king as especially unexpected and audacious. And in a subtle way, this characterization actually addresses one of the gaps that we mentioned above, namely the meager description of judgment of the oppressor that we get in Daniel 8 and verse 25. There's just like a few words on that. So Philip Alexander, he very helpfully identifies a number of key deep axioms that are underlying apocalyptic and messianic ideology. And one of them is God setting to right all that's wrong in the world. So no matter how dire the situation, there's complete assurance that God will set things aright. So, in a sense, as an apocalyptic vision, and by highlighting this oppressive king as so extremely contrary and arrogant, this allusion makes his judgment all the more sure, even if the vision itself doesn't explicitly detail his downfall. Now, another allusion we'll come back to makes this even more explicit. But before we get there, we're going to move to Deuteronomy 28 and focus on why the people of God will suffer under this king in the first place. So, when Gabriel explains the vision to Daniel in verse 23, the opening title that he uses to describe the oppressive small horn is that he is a king of strong face, Ospanim. Or maybe you could translate this a staunch-faced king or a resolute. Perhaps it's a little bit of an odd idiom, strong of face, but it seems clear enough in the immediate context given the king's power, his arrogance, his duplicity. But there's one other place in the Hebrew Bible that uses this phrase, which is Deuteronomy 28:50. Now, Deuteronomy 28 details the blessings and curses which will follow keeping or breaking God's covenant with the people of Israel. So Israel being conquered by other nations factors as a key part of the curses, and specifically by a staunch-faced, strong-faced Ospanim nation who swoops down on them like an eagle with no regard for the vulnerable. So that's Deuteronomy 28:50. And crucially, this is the only two occurrences of this phrase, Ospanim, is Daniel 8 and Deuteronomy 28:50. And moreover, the use of this phrase is in the context of a foreign adversary, be that a king or a nation, and that makes it all the more overt as a possible signal that we're supposed to recognize and look to Deuteronomy 28. But the connections don't stop there. There's more. So another shared word pair comes just a couple verses later we'll start here. There we go. With a holy people. So this phrase, a holy people, Am Kadosh, is a distinctive title for Israel in Deuteronomy. It's the only book that uses that phrase aside from here in Daniel. In the early parts of Deuteronomy, the phrase gives the reason why Israel should maintain the covenant. So there's this repeated phrase, because you are Yahweh your God's holy people, Am Kadosh, don't do this, right? As the book draws to a close, however, the same phrase also expresses the results of obedience in addition to the reason for it. God will make Israel prosper as a holy people. So that's Deuteronomy 26:19 and 28:9. And more could be said about this, of course, but as part of the broader allusion with Deuteronomy 28, Daniel 8:25 picks up this key phrase. Now, the specific phrasing is slightly different. So Daniel 8:24 has Am Kadashim with holy in the plural, whereas Deuteronomy has Am Kadosh with holy in the singular, but the word pair is still notable nonetheless. Moreover, the conclusion and penultimate verse of both passages shares a word cluster, a group of words. So evening plus morning plus vision or sight. So as Daniel 8 draws to a close, Gabriel tells Daniel, the vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given to you is true. And this seems to be in reference to the regular offering being taken away, the regular offering being given at evening and morning, right? But also the duration of oppression that's described in verse 14. But notably, this combination of three words also comes up in Deuteronomy 28. So in Deuteronomy 28:67, also the penultimate, second to last verse in the chapter, Moses sums up the horrendous curses following disobedience by saying, in the morning you shall say, if only it were evening. At evening you shall say, if only it were morning, because of the dread that your heart shall feel, and the sights, vision, that your eyes shall see. Now, as you'll notice, the phrasing and syntax isn't the same in both of them, but that grouping of words together still points to a connection, an allusion that's at work there. So once again, the question is, what's the point? What's the purpose? What does this bear on Daniel 8? So if we start with the figures of the staunch-faced king and nation, we have two possibilities. One, it could be that Daniel 8 is comparing the situation depicted in Deuteronomy with this future suffering that Israel will suffer under this Greek king, right? It could be just a comparison that's going on. Another possibility, though, is that it could be that Daniel 8 is identifying this Greek king as the ruthless nation who will swoop down and conquer the people, either as a fulfillment or as a continued expression of the same prophesied reality. In either case, if we look more broadly, this allusion also addresses one of the gaps that was mentioned at the beginning, namely the reason why the people are suffering. So, although Daniel 8 is silent as to why the people will face such oppression, Deuteronomy 28 is clear that the future suffering is due to and dependent on the people's disobedience, right? They're breaking the covenant. It's one of the curses that follows that. And once again, it's possible to read this as a comparison. So the people will break the covenant again and thus suffer a similar fate again, or as an identification. The people will continue to suffer for the same breaking of the covenant that led to the exile. This is still outworking the same reality, the same curse. And a few factors lead me to that latter option of this being a continued expression of the punishment for the disobedience before the exile. So first off, it would explain why the vision jumps to an already returned people and an already rebuilt temple without the in-between picture of restoration. By skipping any of the returns from exile or those positive pieces, it's possible that the vision of Daniel 8 is presenting these events as a continuation of the punishments associated with exile. In other words, it's just not over yet. But more than this is exactly the direction that Daniel 9 seems to go. So in Daniel 9, Daniel reads Jeremiah's prophecies about Jerusalem lasting 70 years, and responds by both confessing the people's sin and petitioning God for his promised restoration. And in and of itself, this is a fascinating and incredible example of intertextuality. But there's more people who have written on this. If you want to know more, you could read Jordan's book or go to his talk this afternoon. That'd be great. But the most relevant piece for now is how in Daniel 9:24, Gabriel tells Daniel, basically, no, it's not 70 years, it's 70 weeks of years, 490 years actually. Quote, to finish the transgression, to complete the sin, to atone for guilt, to bring righteousness forever, and to seal vision and prophet, and to anoint a holy of holies. So that's Daniel 9:24. In other words, the curses laid out in the law of Moses are still being worked out even while and even after the people return and Jerusalem and the temple are rebuilt. So to summarize, I'd argue that Daniel 8 alludes to Deuteronomy 28 to depict the future suffering under this Greek king as a continued outworking of the curses laid out by Moses. And by means of this allusion, Daniel 8 anticipates and is consistent with what is made more clear in Daniel 9. But, so the reason for, backing up, so the reason for the people suffering is addressed in Daniel 8, even if not directly. But so also is the hope for deliverance and the assurance of justice, as we'll see in the next example as we turn to the book of Ezekiel. So there are two phrases in Daniel 8 that establish a broad connection with the book of Ezekiel. So first off is Daniel 8:17, Gabriel refers to Daniel as Son of Man. This title is distinctive of Ezekiel. It's used in direct address to Ezekiel over 90 times in the book, and that accounts for the vast majority of instances of this phrase in the Hebrew Bible. And the fact that Daniel 8:17 not only uses this same phrase, but uses the phrase as a direct address from an angelic being to the prophet makes the connection all the more overt, because that's the pattern of how the title works in Ezekiel. And moreover, as Gabriel approaches him, Daniel falls upon his face until Gabriel touches him and sets him back on his feet. So this is Daniel 8:17 and 18. The same scene where the prophet falls down and needs to be stood back up when encountering a divine or angelic figure plays out a handful of times in the book of Ezekiel with a fair degree of overlap in language, especially the phrase, I fell upon my face. So that's the end of chapter 1, also in Ezekiel 3:23, 9:8, 11:13, 43, 3 and 4. So both of those, the direct address as Son of Man and the falling down, being stood back up motif points to the book of Ezekiel in general. But the question is, where specifically are we supposed to look in the book of Ezekiel? And there's actually a few options that aren't mutually exclusive here, but the one I'd like to explore today is Ezekiel 34 and 35. So Ezekiel 34 begins with this critique of the rampant injustice of Israel's leaders. So God compares the people to a flock of sheep under the care of cruel shepherds, promising to step in himself as their shepherd to restore justice. In the middle of the chapter, though, the metaphor used to describe the corrupt leaders switches from that of uncaring shepherds to violent sheep, rams, and goats within the flock. Sound familiar? Right? Yeah. So these are actually the only two texts where rams and goats are combative in this way. So in this way, Ezekiel 34 and Daniel 8 correspond in their description of rams and goats acting contrary to their role as sacrificial animals, as described in the rest of the Hebrew Bible. Moreover, there's a few shared words to describe this, notably ram, ayil. Goat is a different word in Ezekiel 34. It's atud rather than ez or saphir or sa'ir that we get in Daniel 8. But there's also the verb to trample in both texts. There's trampling, mirmas, gor, nagach. So these things together, there's these connections going on with Ezekiel 34 on a thematic and then also at a verbal level. And the connections continue on to the next chapter in Ezekiel 35. So in Ezekiel 35, Ezekiel receives a prophecy against Mount Seir in Edom on account of how Edom has antagonized Israel and reveled in her destruction. Similar to Ezekiel 34, there's several shared terms present in Daniel 8. So the first of these is the reference to the transgression that makes desolate in Daniel 8:13. So desolation, or the verb to make desolate, the words related to the Hebrew root shamam, that's a key root in Ezekiel 35. There's 9 uses of this root in a very short, in a 15-verse chapter. So 9 uses in a 15-verse chapter in Ezekiel 35. So it's a key word there. And another connection is the word pair 8 kates, time of the end, that we get in Daniel 8:17. Though it's not the same phrasing, we also get that word pair in Ezekiel 35:5. And last and the most interesting one to me, at least, is also through a pun. So a pun, there we go. So a pun with Seir, goat, in Daniel 8:21, and Seir, the place name for Mount Seir in Ezekiel 35. Now, maybe before today, a pun kind of signaling an allusion might sound like a stretch, but as we've seen in these first 2 sessions, it's very common for biblical authors to mix business and pleasure when it comes to wordplay. Puns are very important. But there's a few factors here, especially that make me think that this is really signaling a connection. One is that already there's a number of verbal and thematic parallels that are tying these together, so it doesn't all hang on this one word, right? Alongside that, there's a lot of punning that's going on throughout Ezekiel 35 and then also in Daniel 8. And we could come back to this in the Q&A if that's something we want to talk about more. Don't have necessarily time to go into that now. But last, in addition to all this, in Daniel 8:21, this is the only time that the goat is described with this word in Daniel 8, Seir. But it follows immediately after another term for goat. So Seir in Daniel 8:21 is redundant. It doesn't actually do anything as you're reading the sentence. So that makes it draws your attention to it as a reader, and then makes it all the more effective as a signal to why it's there, and that leads you to look to these connections. So with all of these connections in mind between Daniel 8 and Ezekiel 34 and 35, again, we turn to the purpose. As mentioned before, one of the gaps in Daniel 8 is the absence of any message of hope or deliverance. However, Ezekiel 34 provides that picture of peace, even in a way that fits the imagery of Daniel 8. So at the end of Ezekiel 34, God provides safe pasture for his sheep, promises protection from these combative animals, promises a new David as a coming shepherd to serve and look after his people. So by means of this allusion, we're reminded of this promised restoration. And similarly, both Ezekiel 34 and 35 together fill in the gap of how little detail is provided regarding any justice exacted, especially against this oppressive Greek king. So Ezekiel 34 provides a picture of the judgment against Israel's internal enemies, but also more particularly the allusion to the judgment against Seir in Ezekiel 35 serves as an assurance of judgment against Seir, the goat, in Daniel 8. So, to conclude, we've discussed 3 examples of biblical allusion in Daniel 8. So, 1, the ironically combative and sacrilegious actions of the ram and goat despite being sacrificial animals. 2, Deuteronomy 28 and the staunch-faced nation king and the continued outworking of Israel's punishment for breaking their covenant with Yahweh. And 3, the pictures of restoration and justice in Ezekiel 34 and 35. In the first example, the combative nature of the goat highlights its arrogance, especially that of the small horn, the future Greek king who takes center stage. Moreover, the fact that it is a sacrificial animal who upends the sacrificial system emphasizes the audacity of that figure's actions and, by implication, the assurance of his downfall. Now, these themes are present whether or not one recognizes the subversive allusion between Daniel 8 and Leviticus 16 and Numbers 28 and 29, but the interplay of these texts nonetheless reinforces some of the central ideas of the chapter in a more poignant and ironic way. The second and third examples, on the other hand, play a more dynamic function in the interpretation of the chapter by filling larger gaps that otherwise would be left unaddressed in Daniel 8. So the correspondence with Deuteronomy 28 addresses the gap of why Daniel foresees the people of God suffering even after the return from exile and rebuilding of the temple. By means of numerous shared phrases with Deuteronomy 28, Daniel 8 identifies this future suffering as a continuing consequence of the people's violation of the covenant as established in Deuteronomy. Though somewhat opaque in Daniel 8, this reading is confirmed by Daniel 9, where it is made more explicit in Gabriel's conversation with Daniel about the 70 weeks of years. On the more hopeful end, though, Daniel 8's correspondence with Ezekiel 34 and 35 also addresses the second and third gaps mentioned, providing a picture of pastoral restoration and judgment against Greece. In each of these examples, the vision of Daniel 8 thus subtly provides a way for attentive readers to fill in the gaps. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ethan. I'll give you a minute or two to type any questions you have. In the meantime, while you're doing that, I'll just start with a question. When we see this theme of restoration and God warning them to turn back to him, how do you see a response for us and a purpose for us in our own lives?
Yeah. I mean, I think as was mentioned this morning, these cycles, these parallels, it's not just an isolated situation here. It's something that you see come up over and over again. And even and how Daniel 8 connects to Daniel 7, I think Daniel 8 is even set up to, in the ways it alludes to that, as saying this is an expression of what's going on in Daniel 7 even too. So, so I think we can have a similar hope, a similar expectation, and in the face of suffering, but then also a similar warning, I suppose, to have the humility that's modeled by Daniel in Daniel chapter 9.
Do you see any correlation between Daniel and Ezekiel, and then any correlation with the rams, maybe communication there with Jeremiah 29?
I haven't looked at that. I'd have to think about that. But.
Okay. Great. Well, I think we're a little bit past our time for today, so I'll go ahead and wrap us up, and thank you for coming to our presentation.
Right. Thanks, everyone.